February 16, 1943, somewhere in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. 68 north, 20 west. The sky hung low with clouds the color of gunmetal. The sea was quiet, too quiet for a war zone. Aboard the German destroyer Z-36, Lieutenant Otto Müller leaned against the bridge rail, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the mist ahead. What he saw made him laugh out loud. Mein Gott, are they building ships from ice now? He joked to the helmsman. Through the fog, a massive white wall floated motionless, shimmering like a glacier. It looked absurd, more like a frozen cliff than any man-made object. For days, German crews had heard wild rumors from U-boat captains that the British were building aircraft carriers out of frozen water. The idea was so ludicrous, it became a running joke across the fleet. Muller smirked, tapping his binoculars. Next, they'll fight us with snowballs. But then, the radar officer spoke. His voice trembled. Sir, it's not drifting, it's holding position. The laughter stopped. Hours earlier, Allied engineers had been testing something extraordinary off the coast of Newfoundland, a slab of pykrete, a new kind of ice composite. To the naked eye, it looked like solid ice. But inside, it was reinforced with sawdust and wood pulp. A strange mixture that made it harder than concrete, and tougher than steel, when kept below freezing. The experiment was part of a secret project so audacious that even the scientists doubted it at first. Project Habakkuk, the construction of unsinkable aircraft carriers made from ice. But in that moment, Muller and his crew didn't know that. All they saw was an iceberg that refused to melt, a floating fortress defying the laws of nature. And for the first time, they began to wonder, what if the rumor wasn't a joke after all? The irony was that just a few months earlier, even the Allies had laughed at the same idea. It was born in one of Britain's darkest hours, when German U-boats were sinking over 100 merchant ships every month, cutting off food, fuel, and weapon supplies to the United Kingdom. The Atlantic Gap, a 300-mile-wide region in the mid-ocean where Allied aircraft couldn't reach, had become a killing ground. Thousands of sailors died there in freezing waters, their convoys helpless against torpedoes that struck from nowhere. Desperation breeds invention. And in that desperation, someone, a man the newspapers would later call the Ice Prophet, had dared to think the unthinkable. But before that genius appeared, before his frozen dream took shape, it was the laughter that defined the idea. In Berlin, in London, even among Royal Navy officers, the concept of ice ships sounded insane. Ships were meant to be built from steel, not frozen water. Aircraft carriers were already the most complex machines humanity had ever built. And yet, as Otto Müller's radar showed that day, the war was about to prove that madness and brilliance often share the same face. The German destroyer turned cautiously toward the ice mass. Müller ordered a closer approach. The men braced for collision, but as they neared, they realized something impossible. The surface wasn't natural. It had angles, contours, and a strange lattice pattern frozen into it. Someone had carved it. Someone had built it. He felt his stomach twist. It's man-made, he whispered. The helmsman asked, Captain, should we open fire? Müller hesitated. The structure wasn't moving, not attacking. Firing on a chunk of ice seemed ridiculous. Yet, for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in an office buried beneath London's Admiralty, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, was staring at a telegram from Canada. Initial tests successful. Structural integrity holding at 0 degrees. Request further funding. He grinned. The first prototype of Project Habakkuk had survived field tests. It hadn't cracked, melted, or collapsed. Against all odds, a ship made of ice had floated, carried weight, and resisted bullets. What began as an eccentric dream was slowly turning into one of the most audacious military experiments in history. Mountbatten turned to his assistant. The Germans won't be laughing when they see what's coming. And so while Lieutenant Müller stared at an ice wall in the middle of the Atlantic, wondering what demon of nature had put it there, British scientists in frozen Canadian lakes were building an even greater monster, an iceberg the size of an aircraft carrier, capable of carrying bombers across the ocean. It would be called Habakkuk, after the biblical prophet who once wrote, Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, because this truly was marvelous and terrifying. As the North Atlantic wind howled, Müller's destroyer turned away, deciding it was safer to report and retreat than to ram into a wall that refused to yield. He wrote in his logbook that night, it looked like ice, but it behaved like steel. He didn't know that what he saw was merely a fragment, an early test piece, part of a series of secret trials conducted under frozen cover in Canada. But that brief encounter was enough to reach German intelligence, sparking confusion, disbelief, and eventually, fear. Because if the British could turn water into armor, what else were they capable of? This is the Unseen Front, where we uncover the hidden experiments, impossible inventions, and forgotten courage that shaped the Second World War. Subscribe if you dare to face the cold, strange corners of history that most never see. The ice didn't melt that day, and for a brief, haunting moment, both sides, the skeptics and the believers, realized that in war, the line between madness and miracle can be thinner than a sheet of ice. London, December 1942. The city was shrouded in darkness. Street lamps were dimmed by blackout curtains. Even the Thames glowed faintly under the moon, as if it too feared to be seen. Every night, the sound of typewriters in the war rooms competed with the dull thud of distant explosions. Britain was still fighting for its survival, not just against bombs, but against hunger, cold, and the unrelenting siege of the Atlantic. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sat hunched over a pile of casualty reports. One figure repeated again and again. Merchant vessels sunk to 100 per month. That number meant more than lost ships. It meant food shortages in London, rationed lines stretching around corners, and soldiers in North Africa left waiting for ammunition that would never arrive. The German U-boat wolf packs, slender, deadly submarines, hunting in coordinated groups, had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. Between August and November of 1942 alone, they sent more than 2.2 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. 1 in every 4 merchant sailors who left port never returned. The sea had become a weapon, silent, invisible, and merciless. At the time, Allied aircraft could only patrol about 400 miles from either side of the ocean. Beyond that range stretched a no man's land of water nearly 300 miles wide, the infamous Atlantic Gap. It was there that most ships died. If a U-boat spotted a convoy in the gap, it could attack freely, day or night. 4 hours before any air cover could reach them. The Royal Navy called it the Black Pit. And to make matters worse, Britain didn't have enough long-range escort vessels or aircraft to protect every convoy. Churchill once wrote in his memoirs, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." It wasn't hyperbole. Every gallon of fuel, every sack of grain, every shell for the front had to cross that deadly expanse of ocean. Without it, Britain would wither. In the middle of that crisis, the Admiralty began receiving increasingly bizarre proposals from inventors, engineers, and dreamers. Some suggested covering convoys with floating smoke screens. Others proposed towing enormous steel nets to trap torpedoes. One even recommended filling old ships with cork so they would bounce when hit. But then came a suggestion that seemed almost insane, and yet, it caught someone's attention. It came from Geoffrey Pyke, a British scientist and visionary whose mind worked at impossible speeds. Pyke wasn't a soldier or an admiral. He was an outsider, eccentric, brilliant, and often difficult to work with. He believed that the only way to save Allied convoys was to extend air cover across the entire Atlantic. The problem was that aircraft couldn't fly that far, and aircraft carriers were too few, too slow, and too vulnerable. So Pyke asked a question no one else dared. What if the aircraft carrier didn't need to be made of steel? Steel was expensive. Concrete was heavy. But ice was everywhere. It floated. It was self-healing, in cold water. And above all, it was free. Pyke argued that an enormous berg ship could be built from ice, anchored in the North Atlantic, serving as a floating base for patrol bombers. He wrote in his memo, "We are surrounded by a material so strong, so buoyant, and so cheap that nature herself provides it in unlimited quantities." It was madness, yes, but Pyke wasn't entirely wrong. Ice had extraordinary properties, if you could keep it from melting. His vision was simple but revolutionary. A ship 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and 200 feet thick, made almost entirely of frozen water. It could carry up to 150 bombers or fighters, plus barracks and fuel stores. It would be unsinkable. Even if hit by torpedoes, the holes would simply freeze over again in the cold. 2 military minds trapped in the logic of steel and fire. It sounded insane. Yet to a nation running out of materials and hope, it was an idea worth considering. When the proposal reached Lord Louis Mountbatten, head of combined operations and one of Churchill's closest military advisors, he was intrigued. He had seen Pyke's work before. The man had a reputation for wild ideas that sometimes worked. Mountbatten carried the plan straight to Churchill, expecting ridicule. Instead, The Prime Minister reportedly smiled, lit his cigar, and said, "Let's try it. There's nothing we can't freeze if we put our minds to it." And so, the Project Habakkuk was born, named after the biblical prophet, who once said, "Behold thee among the heathen, and regard, and wonder marvelously." Within weeks, a secret team of British and Canadian engineers was dispatched to Patricia Lake, Alberta, where winter's natural cold would serve as their laboratory. What they were about to build would defy both physics and logic. While Britain dreamed of ice ships, the Kriegsmarine tightened its hold. By early 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, had over 400 submarines prowling the Atlantic. His new Type 7C U-boats could dive to 200 meters, fire torpedoes from 1,500 meters away, and vanish before sonar could catch them. Convoys HX-229 and SC-122, March 1943, lost 22 ships in 5 days, with over 500 sailors killed. Each sinking meant more families without fathers, more factories without supplies, more despair in London. Britain was desperate, not just for protection, but for imagination. And that's when the strangest, most secret experiment of the war began to take shape, under the frozen surface of a Canadian lake. Because sometimes, survival demands ideas that sound impossible. The ice ships were coming, and the world, though it didn't yet know it, was about to witness a frozen miracle born out of desperation. In any other time, Geoffrey Pyke might have been forgotten, a man of eccentric brilliance, whose ideas never left his notebook. But war has a way of turning madmen into visionaries. Born in 1893, Pyke was not a soldier, not an engineer in the traditional sense, and certainly not a bureaucrat. He was a polymath, a restless intellect, who believed that logic, not rank, should win wars. Before World War II, he'd proposed mobile classrooms for education reform, solar power research in the 1920s, and even a scheme to evacuate Jewish children from Nazi Europe using disguised merchant ships. Most people dismissed him as impossible to work with, obsessive, erratic, and chronically unkempt. But Lord Mountbatten, who understood that genius rarely comes neatly dressed, saw something more, a man who could imagine beyond the limits of convention. When Pyke's memorandum titled Unsinkable Floating Airfields arrived on Mountbatten's desk in 1942, it didn't read like a military report. It read like prophecy. The problem of sea power, Pyke wrote, is not one of courage or command, but of distance. The ocean is too vast, and steel too small. We must learn to fight with the materials of the earth itself. Ice, snow, and cold. Mountbatten was fascinated. He had the memo summarized and sent to Churchill with one word, scrawled in the margin. Brilliant. Churchill immediately demanded proof. Not a model, not a theory. Proof that ice could indeed be turned into armor. Within days, Mountbatten and his team began experimenting in a cold storage warehouse in London. They froze blocks of pure ice and tested them with small arms fire. As expected, the bullets shattered them. Ice by itself was brittle. One hit and the entire block fractured. Pyke's team needed something better, something that could take a bullet and not break. That's when a young Austrian scientist named Max Peretz, working for Mountbatten's research division, made a discovery that changed everything. He mixed sawdust with water in various ratios, froze the mixture, and tested the results. What emerged was unlike anything seen before. The wood fibers trapped air pockets, absorbed stress, and reduced melting. The result was a composite that was stronger than concrete, resistant to cracking, and able to float without splintering. It was 86% water and 14% wood pulp, yet its density and tensile strength rivaled that of solid rock. When Mountbatten fired a revolver at a block of this new material, the bullet didn't shatter it, it bounced off. One shot even ricocheted, nearly hitting a British admiral in the leg. Churchill was delighted. "I see," he said dryly, "that this new material can defend itself." They named it Pykerete, after Pyke himself. In early 1943, Churchill issued the order, "Proceed with utmost urgency with the construction of a full-scale prototype. This project may well decide the fate of the Atlantic." The codename would be Project Habakkuk, after the biblical verse, "Behold ye among the heathen, and regard, and wonder marvelously." The verse fit perfectly. The plan was indeed marvelous, almost to the point of madness. Under Mountbatten's command, a secret engineering corps was assembled. They were told only that they were building something that could float forever. They worked in the freezing wilderness of Patricia Lake, Alberta, Canada, chosen because it was remote, silent, and already encased in natural cold. Construction began in January 1943. Men worked day and night in sub-zero temperatures, pouring water into wooden molds, layering it with pulp and shavings, and freezing it with massive refrigeration coils. Slowly, the impossible took shape. A prototype ice barge 60 feet long, complete with a refrigeration plant and steel reinforcements. It weighed nearly 1,000 tons, and it floated perfectly. Pyke envisioned something far greater. The final design was nothing less than a floating continent. Length, 2,000 feet longer than the Titanic by almost twice width. 300 feet hull thickness. 40 feet of solid concrete. Deck height, 200 feet above the waterline. Crew, 2,000 men capacity. 150 bombers, or 200 fighters. It would have its own onboard refrigeration system powered by 26 diesel engines, keeping the ice frozen even in warmer seas. Its walls would be bulletproof and torpedo-resistant, absorbing hits that would sink any steel ship. Even if damaged, it wouldn't burn, sink, or splinter. It would simply freeze itself back together. To the desperate Allied planners of 1943, the idea seemed almost divine. One such carrier anchored in the mid-Atlantic could protect entire convoys, refuel aircraft, and act as a mobile base, a floating fortress of frost. But Pyke's genius came at a price. He was notorious for erratic behavior. He refused to wear warm clothing, muttering that a cold mind thinks faster. He slept irregularly, sometimes scribbling equations on the walls of his hut. He argued furiously with engineers, insisting that the laws of physics were merely guidelines to be reinterpreted. Yet amid the chaos, his obsession drove progress. When others said Pyke would melt under pressure, he designed internal cooling pipes. When critics said it was too heavy to maneuver, he proposed electric motors built into the ice hull. He was maddening and indispensable. By the spring of 1943, the prototype in Patricia Lake was ready for inspection. Mountbatten himself arrived with a small team of officers. They expected to see a pile of melting ice. Instead, they found a gleaming, silent structure rising from the lake, like something out of mythology. Half iceberg, half battleship. Mountbatten drew his pistol, aimed at the wall, and fired. The bullet vanished into the ice, leaving only a small white scar. The sound barely echoed. He turned to his staff and said simply, "Gentlemen, I believe we have just seen the future of naval warfare." But that future was fragile. For every ton of picrete, the engineers had to freeze water carefully, maintain a constant temperature below 16 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and reinforce cracks daily. The ship was powerful, but also alive, in a way, always needing attention, always vulnerable to warmth. Still, for a brief, electric moment, it felt as though Geoffrey Pyke's madness might actually change the course of the war. In London, as Churchill received word that the first ice ship floated successfully, he sent a single sentence back: "Let the Germans laugh. Soon, they will see what floats in our imagination." They were still laughing in Berlin, but not for long. The Canadian winter of 1943 was bitter enough to freeze even a man's hope solid, and yet, that was precisely what the British engineers needed. Deep in the wilderness of Patricia Lake, tucked inside Jasper National Park, a group of Allied scientists, carpenters, and military men worked under top-secret orders. Their mission: to create the world's first floating fortress made of ice. To keep curious locals away, the site was disguised as a winter storage depot for military refrigeration units. In reality, beneath the snow-covered tarps and makeshift huts, stood the first laboratory of Project Habakkuk, where dreams, diesel, and frozen water merged into one. The plan itself bordered on the absurd. According to the blueprints, the full-scale ship would be 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and 200 feet thick from keel to deck. To visualize it, that was twice the length of the Titanic, 3 times the width of a football field, and weighing over 2 million tons, an iceberg sculpted by human hands. Each wall was to be 40 feet thick, designed to absorb direct torpedo hits without breaking. Inside, miles of steel pipes would circulate brine at freezing temperatures, powered by 26 diesel engines, keeping the ice hull solid, even in summer waters. On top, a flight deck capable of housing up to 150 bombers, or 200 fighters. The ship's code name among engineers was the Berg ship, but the locals who caught glimpses of it simply called it the thing in the lake. For Pyke and his colleagues, it wasn't just an experiment, it was a statement. Humanity had built ships from wood, then steel, then aluminum. But now, out of desperation, they were turning to nature itself as an ally. Every day was a fight, not against the Germans, but against temperature and time. The engineers worked in layers of wool and oilskins, their breath freezing into clouds as they poured bucket after bucket of water into giant molds lined with sawdust. Each block took hours to freeze, and each layer had to be frozen at just the right temperature to prevent cracking. Max Perutz, the soft-spoken Austrian scientist whose research had made Pyke possible, oversaw the material tests himself. He recorded that a 1-inch layer could withstand 3,000 pounds of pressure before fracturing. But when it did fail, it failed catastrophically, shattering like glass. To prevent that, they installed steel tension cables throughout the test structure, a skeleton within the ice, and reinforced corners with compacted snow. Perutz wrote in his journal, "The structure behaves like a living thing. It creaks, it groans, it heals its wounds with cold." At one point, a refrigeration unit failed overnight, and by morning, a corner of the prototype began to melt and sag. The entire team rushed to refreeze it, spraying cold brine and sealing the surface with more pulp mixture. It worked barely. By March 1943, the Patricia Lake prototype was ready. It wasn't pretty, just a blocky platform about 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and weighing nearly 1,000 tons. But it floated, perfectly balanced. The refrigeration units hummed, the walls glistened like crystal, and the Pyke held. When Mountbatten arrived to inspect the progress, he stepped onto the deck and smiled. "It's like walking on frozen courage," he joked. The engineers tested it ruthlessly. They shot it, drilled it, rammed it with smaller boats. The bullets lodged halfway in. Torpedoes left shallow craters that refroze within hours. One naval officer wrote, half in awe and half in disbelief, "If this thing could be built full scale, it would be indestructible." They began to calculate logistics for mass production. Each ship would require 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 35,000 tons of insulation, cork, and 25 refrigeration units the size of train cars. Construction time, at least 8 months, assuming they had enough men, steel, and fuel to spare. And that was the problem. The war was already consuming resources faster than any empire could supply. Steel went to tanks and planes, diesel to convoys and submarines. Even the pulp needed for Pyke was scarce. Paper factories were operating non-stop for map production, documents, and ammunition packaging. When Churchill's aides saw the first cost projections, they nearly fainted. £10 million, roughly $500 million today. And that was only for one ship. The Navy needed at least 3 to make a difference. Mountbatten defended the idea fiercely, telling Parliament, "We are not building ships. We are building hope." But hope, as the winter thawed, began to melt with the ice. Still, those months in Patricia Lake created something extraordinary. The team Canadians, Britons, Americans, and a handful of European exiles formed a strange brotherhood. They worked 14-hour shifts, laughed through frostbite, and learned to navigate a structure that literally groaned beneath their feet. Perutz would later recall, "When I stood inside those ice walls, hearing the hum of compressors and the creak of frozen timber, I felt as if I was standing inside the bones of the earth." He nearly died once, when a refrigeration line burst and flooded his testing tunnel with freezing brine. Trapped for minutes, he clawed his way out through a wall of softening ice, emerging pale and trembling. He later joked, "At least I now know what it feels like to be part of my own experiment." By the time spring arrived, the prototype had survived 3 months of testing. No one could deny its success. Even in sunlight, it refused to melt. The refrigeration systems worked perfectly. Engineers calculated that a full-scale version could last for 10 years in Arctic waters before structural degradation. The plan was to scale it up immediately. The first target, an operational carrier by mid-1944. It would be stationed halfway across the Atlantic, a floating base, bridging America and Britain, shielding convoys and striking back at U-boats. But as the ice fortress took shape, so did doubt. The world was warming with war. Aluminum aircraft and long-range bombers were already proving they could cross the Atlantic unaided. The ice ship, while magnificent, was becoming less of a necessity and more of a question mark. Still, in that frozen corner of Canada, for a brief moment, humankind had tamed the impossible. They had built a fortress that neither fire nor water could destroy. The Germans, meanwhile, were about to learn that sometimes the strangest rumors turn out to be true. Berlin, spring of 1943. The war machine was roaring. German U-boats ruled the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe was still a force to fear. And the propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels was running at full speed. The Reich was confident. Perhaps too confident. In a smoky intelligence briefing room near Wilhelmstrasse, officers of the Kriegsmarine gathered around a stack of intercepted British documents. Most of them had been captured through Enigma decrypts, and rumors picked up from Norwegian fishermen and Arctic patrols. One memo, half legible, contained the phrase, Operation Habakkuk, Arctic Construction. Oberkommando der Marine Admiral Erich Redder read it aloud, then laughed. An aircraft carrier made of ice. Have the English lost their minds? The room burst into chuckles. One officer remarked, perhaps next, they'll fly snowplanes. Another added, it's typical of Churchill, frozen gin and frozen ships. The laughter was loud, mocking, and smug, the kind born from absolute superiority. But not everyone in the room was laughing. At the corner of the table, a quiet intelligence analyst, Captain Hans Rudel, frowned. He had seen strange things in Norway, Allied convoys moving differently, and odd radar echoes along the Greenland routes. Herr Admiral, he said cautiously, if the British are using the Arctic as a base, we mustn't underestimate their ingenuity. They've built radar from scrap metal before. Redder waved his hand dismissively. Captain, I have no interest in fairy tales. Ice does not win wars. German propaganda quickly turned the rumor into a joke. Berlin radio broadcasters mocked the frozen fleet of fools. Cartoons in the satirical magazine Das Reich depicted Churchill, commanding penguins from an iceberg fortress, puffing his cigar as it melted beneath him. But behind the mockery was something else, unease. Because despite all the derision, reports kept coming in from U-boat captains describing strange radar reflections, echoes that lingered, and large shapes on sonar that didn't move like icebergs. Captain Rudel compiled these accounts into a memo for naval intelligence. It read, multiple U-boats report immobile ice structures with metallic content. If real, these may represent Allied Arctic installations, possibly aircraft staging points, or radar arrays. The memo was filed away. It reached no higher than the desk of a skeptical bureaucrat, who stamped it unverified, probably psychological warfare. Ironically, he wasn't entirely wrong. The British had indeed let rumors of the ice ships slip on purpose, part of a counterintelligence ploy. They wanted the Germans to believe they were building something monumental, something that would tie up German resources chasing ghosts across the Arctic. But even they hadn't expected the Germans to react quite like this. Across the Channel, Lord Mountbatten and Geoffrey Pyke were aware that the Germans had caught wind of the ice project. Mountbatten saw an opportunity. Let them laugh, he told his staff. Mockery is the best camouflage. No one fears a madman, until it's too late. He wasn't wrong. By mid-1943, German Naval Command had diverted 4 reconnaissance flights and 2 patrol submarines north to investigate possible Allied fortifications. Those resources could have been used in the Atlantic War. Instead, they were chasing frozen rumors. Meanwhile, Mountbatten continued to push Habakkuk forward, using the ridicule as cover. Churchill even enjoyed the irony. The Germans mock us, he said in a war cabinet meeting. But if they only knew how close we are to freezing their ambitions solid. But by late summer, something began to change in Berlin. Reports grew harder to ignore. One convoy, Operation PQ-17, had described being shadowed by a large stationary ice mass that did not melt. Even after weeks of relatively warm weather, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance flight over the Greenland Sea captured blurry photographs of something rectangular, not natural, floating in the water. It looked like the side of a glacier had been cut clean with a blade. When those photos reached the German naval staff, the laughter quieted. The officers leaned closer. Could it be? Someone asked. An untold formation? The intelligence chief frowned. It could also be a test. Soon after, Admiral Karl Dönitz himself was briefed. The head of the U-boat fleet was not a man easily amused. If the British are experimenting with new Arctic bases, we must locate them, he ordered. Even a frozen airstrip could threaten our northern routes. The very thing they had mocked was now being considered a legitimate threat. In hindsight, historians often note how German arrogance played a role in the Allies' advantage. They laughed at radar until 1940. They underestimated Allied decoding until Enigma was broken. And now, in 1943, they dismissed a weapon of ice. But the irony is sharper still. While they mocked the idea, they also feared it enough to divert attention. The Kriegsmarine began compiling iceberg reports. Dozens of them, describing phantom floating shapes and radar anomalies. None of them were confirmed, but the paranoia was real. One U-boat commander wrote in his patrol log, "There are icebergs here that do not move with the current. They wait." He never knew that what he'd seen might have been part of a test section of Pyke, towed out for endurance trials near Newfoundland. While Berlin chuckled over their caricatures, the men at Patricia Lake worked tirelessly. They were aware of the ridicule, and strangely, it made them proud. "Let them laugh," said one Canadian engineer. "It'll make the silence sweeter when we freeze their fleet." Pyke himself had become something of a legend at the camp. He walked around with frost clinging to his beard, wearing mismatched gloves and muttering equations aloud. When news of German mockery reached him, he reportedly smiled and said, "Laughter is only proof they haven't thought hard enough." By the end of 1943, the German High Command quietly stopped joking about ice ships. Though no full-scale vessel had yet appeared, the sheer persistence of Allied activity in Arctic waters was unsettling. And then, one strange night, a U-boat crew off Greenland reported being trapped by an ice formation that appeared to move against the current. Their sonar showed it was massive, hundreds of meters across. They tried to circle it, and failed. Within days, the rumor reached Berlin. The English had built a floating wall of ice. The laughter finally stopped. The myth had become real, at least in their minds. And soon, reality would give them something even stranger to fear. Greenland Sea, June 1943. Fog rolled across the water like drifting ghosts. A convoy of German supply ships for cargo vessels, and their U-boat escort, crept through a narrow fjord off the coast of Norway. The Arctic sun was barely visible, a pale disk hovering just above the horizon. Lieutenant Otto Müller, now serving aboard U-387, watched his sonar screen flicker with static. Something enormous was showing up ahead, too large to be another ship, too steady to be a moving iceberg. "That can't be right," he murmured. The echo filled nearly half the radar display. "An island?" the helmsman asked. Müller shook his head. "There's no land here." The convoy slowed. Through the fog, a colossal shadow began to emerge, white, flat-topped, and silent. It looked like a glacier had broken free from the land and chosen to block their path. The captain ordered a course change, but within minutes, another radar contact appeared to the west, then another to the east. It was as if the sea itself had frozen into a wall. What Müller didn't know was that the British had recently conducted a sea endurance test of the Patricia Lake prototype, a smaller section of Pyke, roughly 200 feet long and 60 feet wide, had been reinforced and towed by tugboats into open water near Newfoundland before drifting northward. It was meant to measure how well the material survived natural currents, temperature shifts, and saltwater corrosion. But Arctic winds are unpredictable. The block, along with several smaller test pieces, had detached and drifted into shipping lanes near Greenland, right into the path of a German convoy. For the German sailors, it was an encounter with something almost supernatural. Their instruments couldn't classify it. It wasn't an iceberg, because it didn't melt or rotate. It wasn't a ship, because it gave no heat signature and made no sound. Captain Hartwig of the escort destroyer Z-24 recorded in his log, "We approached what we thought to be an ice formation. It reflected radar but did not break. Gunfire had no effect. It was as if the sea had grown armor. When the destroyer fired its first shells, they shattered harmlessly against the white surface, leaving only splinters of steam. The sound that came back was eerie, a deep, hollow thud, as if the ocean itself had groaned in reply. "Impossible," the first officer muttered. "It's not ice," Müller whispered. "It's something else." The convoy commander ordered the U-boats to dive and circle the obstruction. But the underwater view was worse. The sonar image stretched downward, like the wall of a submerged mountain. The captain decided to turn back, but by then, the current had shifted, pinning them inside the fjord. One of the cargo ships, MS Eisvogel, tried to reverse engines, but struck a submerged portion of the mass. Its propeller jammed. Another vessel collided, trying to maneuver around it, and a third grounded itself on the rocky edge of the fjord. In less than 20 minutes, the convoy's formation disintegrated. In the chaos, U-706 scraped its hull against ice debris and began leaking oil, forcing it to surface. From above, the fog glowed faintly blue, the light from the sun refracting through the frozen Pyke. It looked, as one German sailor later described, like God himself had placed a wall of frozen glass between us and the sea. When fragments of the incident reached Berlin, disbelief turned to concern. The reports described a large artificial ice formation, possibly enemy-built. U-boat command immediately suspected Allied interference, perhaps a new anti-submarine barrier or radar-reflective decoy. Within days, German reconnaissance flights were dispatched to photograph the area. They found nothing, only shattered ice and open water. The ice wall had broken apart and melted. But by then, the rumor had taken hold. In the corridors of naval intelligence, the whispers began again. Was Churchill truly building ships of ice? One officer remarked privately. We laughed. And now the ocean itself laughs back. The psychological effect was immense. For months afterward, U-boat captains reported phantom icebergs, claiming to see frozen structures where none existed. The Arctic seas became haunted in their minds, a realm where the British wielded nature itself. In reality, the incident was a mix of accident and brilliance. The prototype section, reinforced with refrigeration coils, had survived over 5 months in salt water before finally disintegrating. It proved beyond doubt that Pyke could withstand real oceanic conditions, waves, pressure, and heat. Max Perutz's team back in Alberta received the report with astonishment. The test data showed that the material's compressive strength remained nearly constant, and that its melting rate was 5 times slower than ordinary ice. In pure scientific terms, it was a success beyond expectation. But the military saw more than science. They saw a new form of warfare, one that blurred the line between technology and nature. Mountbatten, upon hearing of the German convoy's confusion, allowed himself a rare smile. Let them think we command the ice, he said. It may serve us better than commanding the sea. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Muller, who had witnessed the ice wall firsthand, returned to port shaken. In his after-action report he wrote, We encountered a frozen structure that defied all reason. It did not drift. It did not break. It waited. The sea felt alive. He would survive the war. But that entry, later discovered by Allied historians, became one of the most cited eyewitness accounts in post-war studies of Project Habakkuk. For the Germans, it marked the first and only time they directly faced the tangible result of Britain's strangest wartime experiment. In the months that followed, the ice blockade incident faded into rumor. Officially, the Kriegsmarine called it a navigational anomaly. Unofficially, sailors spoke of the day the North Sea closed its gates. But for the Allies, that drifting block of frozen pulp had done something no weapon could. It had proven the impossible possible. The ice ship, even unfinished, had already influenced the course of the war, reshaping how men thought about engineering, warfare, and imagination itself. The irony, of course, was that while one block of ice terrified the enemy, the project behind it was already beginning to crack under the weight of reality. By the summer of 1943, the Arctic prototype had proven what most of the world thought impossible. Ice could float like steel, resist bullets, and even terrify the Kriegsmarine. Yet, while the engineers at Patricia Lake celebrated their small miracle, the war outside had changed faster than the ice could hold. New aircraft, faster, heavier, and with longer range, were rolling off assembly lines across Britain and America. The B-24 Liberator patrol bomber, with a range of nearly 2,100 miles, could now close the infamous Atlantic Gap. What once required a floating airfield of ice could now be done by machines of metal and fuel. And in the grim arithmetic of war, practicality always trumps wonder. In September 1943, Lord Mountbatten stood before the War Cabinet, presenting the latest report from the Habakkuk project. The prototype had survived 5 months in open water. The Pyke had held beyond expectations, and construction models predicted a full-scale carrier could be completed within a year. Churchill listened, cigar in hand, eyes heavy from exhaustion. The Prime Minister had been the project's loudest supporter, but he also knew the brutal truth. The war's priorities had shifted. Every ounce of steel, every ton of diesel, and every hand of labor now needed to push into southern Europe for the coming invasion. £10 million, the Chancellor of the Exchequer muttered, tapping the report. For one ship that will never leave the ice. Mountbatten argued passionately. Sir, this is more than a ship, it is a symbol. The Germans already fear what they don't understand. Habakkuk could make the Atlantic ours. Churchill stared out the window at the rain streaking across London's rooftops. Symbols don't win wars, he said quietly. Men and machines do. The silence that followed was colder than the Arctic itself. The figures were staggering. To build a single full-sized Habakkuk would require 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 40,000 tons of insulation cork, 35 refrigeration plants, and a workforce of more than 10,000 men for at least 8 months. Worse still, Pyke's strength was a double-edged sword. It was too heavy to maneuver icily, and required constant refrigeration. Each ship would consume a ton of fuel per hour just to keep from melting. In simple terms, Habakkuk was indestructible, but also unsustainable. Even Max Perutz, the project's scientific heart, began to lose faith. He had proven his material worked. Now he faced a different truth. Nature always collects her debt. We were trying to cheat the laws of thermodynamics, he wrote later. But the laws were patient, and they waited. By October, the project's funding was quietly reduced. The research teams in Canada received fewer shipments, then fewer men. What had once been a buzzing construction camp turned into a ghostly frozen yard where compressors hummed to no audience. The Patricia Lake prototype remained floating, its refrigeration pump still running, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Perutz and a handful of engineers stayed behind to record long-term data on melting rates. Each morning, they drilled into the hull to measure thickness. Each evening, they logged the slow, steady numbers, a loss of 1/10 of an inch per day. That was the pace at which their dream was dying. In November, the final telegram arrived. Project Habakkuk, development suspended until further notice. Mountbatten didn't bother to hide his anger. "We've proven it works," he told his aides. "But now they call it a curiosity. They'll regret that." He was half right. Max Perutz returned to England in the winter of 1944. He had started the project as a physicist and ended it as a philosopher. During his final inspection, he stood on the frozen deck, listening to the quiet hum of the remaining engines. The air was so still that even his breath seemed afraid to disturb it. He pressed his gloved hand against the ice and whispered, "You lasted longer than we did." In his notebook that day, he wrote his last entry for Habakkuk. "Our ship was unsinkable, but not unstoppable bureaucracy." Perutz's later research on the molecular structure of ice, work he began during these experiments, would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1962. The ship may have melted, but its science endured. By early 1944, the refrigeration generators at Patricia Lake were shut down. The engineers packed up their tools and left. No ceremony, no salute, no farewell. The structure began to melt slowly, seeping back into the water it came from. Within a few weeks, it was gone, the last fortress of ice returning to the quiet depths of Canada. All that remained was a small buoy marking the site. Fishermen in Jasper sometimes claimed they could still see a faint shimmer. Beneath the surface, a ghostly reflection of white on blue. Back in London, the war pressed on. The Allies no longer needed ice ships. They had air superiority, radar, and the approaching promise of D-Day. Habakkuk faded into classified archives, a frozen dream buried under paperwork in progress. But those who had worked on it never forgot. Even in its cancellation, Project Habakkuk proved something profound. That desperation can breed unimaginable innovation. The Allies had taken the simplest substance on Earth, water, and turned it into a weapon. It didn't sail into battle, but it reshaped how military scientists thought about materials, endurance, and imagination. Years later, when asked about the project, Mountbatten smiled wistfully and said, "It was the strangest thing I ever built, and the only one that could melt if you believed in it too much." In that sentence, lived the perfect summary of the project's fate. Habakkuk had conquered physics, but it couldn't conquer the cold logic of war. And as the snow fell on Patricia Lake one last time, it buried beneath it, not failure, but one of the greatest what-ifs of the 20th century. History remembers Project Habakkuk as a failure, but science remembers it differently. Long after the compressors at Patricia Lake fell silent, the data collected from the frozen ship revealed something extraordinary. Mankind had, for a brief moment, stumbled upon one of nature's hidden engineering miracles. The genius of Pyke. That strange hybrid of sawdust and ice lay in its simplicity. Ordinary ice was fragile. Strike it with a hammer, and it would fracture instantly. But when mixed with 14% wood pulp, something remarkable happened. The wood fibers disrupted the crystalline structure of the ice, trapping microscopic air pockets that absorbed energy and slowed melting. The result was a composite material that was 5 times tougher than natural ice and could float indefinitely in freezing water. At temperatures below freezing, it could withstand the impact of rifle bullets. When tested with torpedoes, it didn't shatter, it bent. In engineering terms, it was the world's first biocomposite, decades before the term existed. To Geoffrey Pyke, it was poetry. To Max Perutz, it was physics. And to history, it was a lesson that sometimes the world's most advanced ideas come not from new metals, but from reimagining what already surrounds us. Perutz's team meticulously measured every physical property of Pyke during the project. At 15 degrees Celsius, the material could support 700 pounds per square inch psi of pressure before deforming. For comparison, Structural concrete fails at around 500 psi. Even at slightly higher temperatures near freezing, its performance remained astonishing. Its melting rate was equally fascinating. Ordinary ice melts at roughly 1 centimeter per hour in mild weather. Pykrete, just 2 millimeters per hour. The wood acted like insulation, preventing heat from spreading evenly. And when cracks appeared, the fibers redirected the stress. The ice literally healed itself. In modern materials science, we call this micro-cracked self-arrest. Back then, they just called it magic. Peretz later wrote, "It was as if we had discovered a new state of matter, neither solid nor liquid, but alive." Working with pykrete, however, was not without danger. Engineers at Patricia Lake suffered frostbite, exhaustion, and injuries from collapsing ice tunnels. The refrigeration systems, running day and night, were unpredictable. One night, a coolant pipe burst and filled a cabin with freezing ammonia gas. Several workers had to be pulled out unconscious. Yet, despite the hardships, morale remained strangely high. These men understood. They weren't just fighting a war. They were testing the limits of nature itself. They nicknamed themselves the Cold Commandos. For many, the project was the first time they'd seen scientists treated like soldiers. Not in uniform, but armed with thermometers, slide rules, and courage. From a modern standpoint, pykrite's strength makes perfect sense. The sawdust fibers in the ice prevented microfractures from propagating, much like the way steel rebar reinforces concrete. When energy hit the surface from a bullet, explosion, or wave impact, it dissipated through the fibers instead of concentrating at one point. Thermally, it was also a marvel. Ice conducts heat at about 2.2 watts per meter Kelvin. But the addition of wood fibers dropped that to 0.8 WMK, roughly the same as cork insulation. That meant it could remain solid even in warmer air for long periods, provided it was shaded and internally cooled. In theory, a properly refrigerated pykrete ship could operate as far south as the Bay of Biscay, thousands of miles from the Arctic. Though Habakkuk was cancelled, its science didn't melt with it. Decades later, the principles discovered during the project resurfaced in unexpected places. Cold region construction. Engineers in Canada and Scandinavia adapted pykrete research for ice roads and Arctic oil rigs. The idea of reinforcing ice with fibers evolved into synthetic equivalents used for temporary runways and remote bases. Composite materials. The concept of distributing stress through microscopic fibers became the foundation of fiberglass, carbon fiber, and reinforced plastics, materials that would later define modern aviation and space exploration. Thermal insulation research. The experiments with sawdust and ice led to improved understanding of how porous materials conduct heat, knowledge that influenced refrigeration, cryogenics, and even the design of early space habitats. In short, a failed ice ship had quietly laid the groundwork for the materials that would one day reach the stars. After the project ended, Max Peretz returned to his first love, biology. But he never forgot what the ice had taught him about the invisible structures of matter. Using X-ray crystallography, he began studying the molecular structure of hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in our blood. He applied the same principles he'd learned from pykrete, how internal bonds, even weak ones, could give a structure incredible stability. In 1962, Peretz received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, sharing it with John Kendrew. When asked what inspired his methods, he smiled and said, "The ice did." For Geoffrey Pyke, the story ended differently. His mind, once ablaze with imagination, burned itself out. The war's end left him restless, unmoored without a battle to fight. He continued writing proposals for humanitarian projects, alternative education, and world peace. But governments no longer needed dreamers. They needed order. In 1948, Pyke took his own life in a London hotel. He left behind no fortune, only notebooks filled with ideas, some decades ahead of their time. Mountbatten, upon hearing the news, reportedly said, "The man who thought in frozen fire has gone. The world will thaw a little colder without him." Science, at its best, is born from questions no one else dares to ask. Project Habakkuk asked one that seemed absurd, and, for a fleeting moment, answered it. Could mankind build a fortress out of ice? Yes, for a while. But could mankind learn something everlasting from it? Absolutely. In that frozen lake in Alberta, the boundaries of imagination were redrawn. Not by soldiers or politicians, but by scientists with frostbitten hands and an impossible dream. They proved that the line between genius and madness is as thin and as fragile as a layer of ice. 3 decades after the war ended, the forests around Patricia Lake grew thick again. The snow buried all trace of what had once been the strangest shipyard on Earth. Yet under the lake's surface, cold, dark and forgotten, something still slept. In 1970, a team of Canadian divers searching for World War II wrecks stumbled upon something unexpected. Rusted metal piping, refrigeration coils, and fragments of insulated wood pulp, perfectly preserved beneath the silt. They had rediscovered what was left of Project Habakkuk. When news reached the Canadian government, a quiet investigation followed. Old British records were declassified, photographs examined, and the truth resurfaced. This was the skeleton of the ice ship, once secret, once absurd, and once feared. The divers reported that even after 27 years underwater, remnants of picrete still clung to the lakebed walls. It hadn't completely melted. The ice, one diver said, hadn't forgotten. Today, a small plaque sits near the edge of that quiet, Alberta lake. Few tourists notice it, and fewer still understand the magnitude of what happened there. It reads simply, "On this site, in 1943, Allied scientists built and tested an experimental structure for Project Habakkuk, a vessel of ice and imagination." The site is now recognized as a National Historic Monument of Canada, but no museum could ever capture what it must have felt like to stand on that frozen deck in 1943, to walk across a material that shouldn't exist and believe even for a moment that it might win a war. For those who built it, it was more than an experiment. It was defiance in its purest form. Humanity's refusal to accept that something was impossible, just because it sounded absurd. Although Project Habakkuk never reached the battlefield, its ripples spread across the world of science and engineering. Cold region architecture. Decades later, engineers used the same principles of reinforced ice for Arctic runways, mining roads, and temporary structures in Siberia and Alaska. Even the design of modern ice hotels in Scandinavia owes a nod to Pyke's living ice. Material science. The research on picrete's internal structure directly influenced the development of fiberglass and polymer composites, materials that combine flexibility with strength. Every carbon fiber aircraft today owes a microscopic debt to that sawdust and ice experiment. Naval engineering. The lessons from the refrigeration systems and large-scale cooling logistics of Habakkuk later informed the design of Arctic oil platforms and nuclear submarine bases. Some engineers even half-jokingly referred to these as Habakkuks in steel. The project proved something every innovator now takes for granted. Nature's materials can be engineered, not just used. In a curious twist of fate, the same winter that Habakkuk was cancelled, Allied long-range bombers and escort aircraft began patrolling the Atlantic full-time, closing the deadly gap that had inspired the project in the first place. The ice ship became obsolete before it was ever born. And yet, the Germans, who once mocked the idea, never stopped wondering if the British had succeeded. After the war, when Allied archives were opened, German officers expressed shock. It was real. One admiral said in disbelief, "We thought it was propaganda." Indeed, the project they had dismissed as fantasy turned out to have existed all along, a weapon of imagination that had nearly come to life. For those who worked on Habakkuk, its cancellation was both a relief and a heartbreak. Many of them went on to careers in engineering and academia. But when interviewed years later, their voices softened when the topic arose. One Canadian technician, interviewed in 1968, said, "We didn't just build ice, we built hope, and it melted, like all things do. But it was beautiful while it lasted." Another veteran added, "You could hear the ice creak at night, like it was breathing. We used to joke it had a soul. Maybe it did." In those few months of frozen labor, these men glimpsed a kind of unity that transcended war. Soldiers, scientists, and dreamers, working together against the laws of nature. Today, only fragments of refrigeration pipes remain beneath Patricia Lake, yet the legacy of Habakkuk still glows faintly, like light trapped beneath the ice. Every university textbook that mentions picrete, every experiment that studies natural composites, every Arctic engineer who thinks beyond conventional materials, they all walk on the same frozen footsteps. And beyond science, the story remains a metaphor. The idea that faith in innovation, even absurd innovation, can arise from humanity's darkest hour. Churchill once said that wars are won not only by force, but by imagination. Project Habakkuk was proof of that. Imagination sculpted into something you could touch, stand on, and believe in, if only for a fleeting moment. When modern scientists revisit Parrott's notes, or Pyke's sketches, They often described the project as the first eco-engineered structure, a creation that didn't fight nature but used it. That philosophy lives on today in sustainable architecture and green technology. Somewhere deep below Patricia Lake, in layers of mud and frozen sediment, lie the last traces of the ship that once made even the sea itself seem conquerable. Every winter, when the lake freezes over again, the ice glows faintly under the northern lights. Locals say that if you walk out onto the surface at dawn and listen closely, you can still hear a distant hum, the ghost of the old compressors, or perhaps the echo of a dream that refused to die. The Germans laughed first. But time, like ice, has a long memory, and history remembers who built, not who mocked. The war ended, the oceans thawed, and the world moved on. Yet, amid the thousands of innovations born of World War II, the jet engine, the atomic bomb, radar, penicillin, one stands apart for its sheer audacity. A ship made of ice. It never fought a battle, never fired a gun, and never sailed across the Atlantic. But it did something else. It proved that imagination itself could be a weapon. By 1945, Project Habakkuk had already disappeared into classified archives. A footnote buried under the enormity of D-Day and Hiroshima. But among those who knew of it, the engineers, the scientists, the officers who once believed in it, the idea never melted away. It lingered in their conversations, their memoirs, and their sense of what human beings were capable of under pressure. Max Perutz would later describe the project not as a failure, but as a rehearsal for courage. Geoffrey Pyke's name became a whisper in history, too strange to be celebrated, too brilliant to be forgotten. Even Churchill, who eventually abandoned the project, mentioned it in passing, years later with a trace of fond amusement. We were prepared to build an island and float it to victory. It was, in its own peculiar way, the most human of wartime dreams, an attempt to turn fragility itself into strength. When you strip away the ice, the pulp, and the blueprints, Project Habakkuk stands as a story about belief. It asked men to imagine the unthinkable, that something soft, melting, and fleeting could outlast steel. In every sense, it was a paradox, a weapon built from weakness, a fortress that could melt in sunlight, an idea both absurd and magnificent. But paradox is often where progress begins. As one engineer later said, it wasn't about building an ice ship. It was about proving we could build anything if we had to. The war demanded miracles. And Habakkuk delivered one, not on the battlefield, but in the laboratory of human imagination. If you look closely, you can still see Habakkuk's fingerprints on history. In the design of Arctic research stations, insulated by composite foams. In the aerospace composites that blend lightness with resilience. In the philosophy of engineering that says, if it works in theory, it deserves a chance in practice. The concept of thinking past practicality, daring to dream in the middle of desperation, became one of the hallmarks of Allied innovation. From floating mulberry harbors at Normandy, to inflatable tanks used to deceive the Germans. The same spirit of improbable creation ran through it all. Habakkuk wasn't an isolated madness. It was part of a pattern, proof that even during humanity's darkest moments, the mind's light could still flicker bright enough to freeze time itself. In 1988, a British journalist visited Patricia Lake with one of the original engineers, now an old man. Standing by the water, he tossed a handful of snow into the lake and watched it dissolve. It was never really about the ice, was it? The journalist asked. The old man smiled faintly. No, it was about believing the ice could hold. And perhaps that's what makes Habakkuk timeless. Every generation faces its own impossible problems. Climate, war, survival, fear. And in each of them lies a small echo of those men in Alberta, freezing their hands to turn water into armor. For the Channel S viewers, for those who seek out the forgotten corners of history, Project Habakkuk is not just a curiosity. It is a mirror. It reflects what humans do when cornered by despair. They invent, they build, they try. The unseen front exists to uncover those moments. The places where courage met absurdity, where intellect met desperation, and where imagination refused to surrender. Because history is not just a record of victories. It's a gallery of mad ideas that dared to exist. In the end, Project Habakkuk didn't need to change the course of the war, to change the way we think. It reminded us that the most fragile things, ideas, hopes, even ice, can shape the hardest moments in human history. And so, as the last frost melts into Patricia Lake each spring, it carries with it the memory of men who tried to turn the impossible into reality. Was Pyke a madman? Was Mountbatten a dreamer? Or were they simply ahead of their time? Men who understood that the true battlefield of the 20th century was not in the skies or the seas, but in the mind. The lake is silent now, but if you stand on its shore at dawn, when the air bites and the world holds its breath, you might just hear it at a low hum, a heartbeat of frozen ambition, echoing from beneath the water. A reminder that even the coldest dreams can outlast the fire of war. Because imagination, once frozen into history, never truly melts.